Good afternoon, and thank you all for staying for this final presentation. I'd like to thank Taylor in particular for the invitation, as well as the program committee. And before I even start, I want to acknowledge the fact that anytime you're involved in a program like cardiac rehabilitation, you're only as good as the people surrounding you. A lot of those people are here today, and I want to acknowledge our Beaumont staff, who is in my opinion, second to none. So it's you guys who really make the program go. Thank you. I have a formidable challenge, and that is to talk about triggers for acute coronary events, which I think is oftentimes underutilized, undervalued. But I want to open up with a couple slides that I got a chuckle, and I think you'll get a chuckle from too. This was an email I got about a year ago from a colleague of mine, a good friend, Dr. Contractor in Mumbai, India. Said, Dr. Franklin, I was so pleased to see your famous quote on our European Preventive Cardiology conference bag. Congratulations. Hell, that's not my quote. It's Benjamin Franklin, B. Franklin. I wish it was my quote, but it wasn't. What many people don't know is that quote was offered, had nothing to do with health that you and I do. It was on preventing fires. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Ben Franklin, how do we prevent fires? Okay, that said, what many people don't know or don't recognize is that a large percentage of heart attacks are actually triggered by a transient increase in sympathetic stimulation, which leads to a cascade of physiologic effects: increased catecholamines, increased cortisol, vasoconstriction, increased myocardial demands. We now know for sure, and it's a fact, that between 6 a.m. and noon, the greatest number of heart attacks occur. Simply getting out of bed, all kinds of physiologic changes occur. And as a result, oftentimes the greatest number of heart attacks occur in that time period, but the pharmaceutical industry has realized if you put people on a drug called beta blockers, it blunts that big increase in sympathetic stimulation and literally halts heart attacks among people who are at high risk. These two next studies got my attention. This first one was by Toffler in 1990, I believe. He looked at about 850 patients who reported acute myocardial infarction. And if you look at these data, they're astounding. About half of those people said immediately prior to the heart attack, they got emotionally upset, or they were involved in unusual, strenuous physical exertion, or they were up half the night or 3/4 of the night overeating, overdrinking. So this was one of the early studies to suggest that almost 50% of all heart attacks are triggered by external stimuli. More recently, the InterHeart study published in Circ 2016 looked at over 12,000 cases of acute myocardial infarction. They found that about 14% had engaged in unusual physical exertion. Another 14% were angry or emotionally upset in the period within 1 hour of their beginning to experience symptoms. So they concluded that there are triggers for acute myocardial infarction: heavy physical exertion, anger, emotional upset, or both. As a result of these kinds of things, I decided around 2011 to put together a review paper, and to a large extent what I'm going to cover for you today is that review paper only updated. And ironically, a good friend and colleague, Murray Middleman, did the same topic the same year, kind of summarizing what the literature shows. My job over the next 45 minutes is to summarize all these data for you and make it very practical. This is not so practical, but this was their schematic. And basically what you see is they said heavy lifting, physical activity, anger, extreme alcohol, caffeine, cocaine, marijuana, air pollution, infection can lead to a cascade of physiologic responses that can ultimately result in heart attack, sudden cardiac death, plaque rupture, or stroke. As I put this lecture together, my goal was to make it informative, entertaining, but more specifically, especially the last lecture of the final day, to have you say to yourself as you leave here today, wow, he covered 4 things that I never heard about, so I learned something. That's my goal. Wow, I didn't know that. And the reason I say that is because a lot of this stuff I didn't know till I started actually researching it. I'm going to cover 4 topics. We'll start with physical stress. We'll go down to topic number 4. And once I hit 4, you'll know I'm just about done. You ever listen to a speaker and wonder when the hell is this guy going to get off the stage? When I hit 4, sleeping, I'm just about done. He's got worldwide attention. You've heard the names before if you've been around for a while. Jim Fixx, the age of 52, Vermont, running on a lonely Vermont road, 15 miles, suddenly collapsed and died. More recently, Doug Adams, author Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, was training in a Santa Barbara fitness club. All of a sudden dropped dead, and people said, wow, this guy was as healthy as a horse. How can that be? What many people don't know about this guy is he had a very strong family history of cardiovascular disease. His dad had 3 heart attacks and died of the 3rd heart attack in his mid to late 40s. Secondly, what many people don't know, and I study this stuff for a living, is that Jim Fixx had chest pain the last 3, 4, 5 months of his life when he exercised, and he chose to ignore it because he was in good shape and couldn't be heart-related. It was heart-related. He was also a smoker at one time. So what we're going to do is talk about some of these phenomena, so to speak. The other thing I'll point out to you is 2009, the day of the Free Press Marathon, was one of the busiest days of my life. And I knew this was coming. And the newscaster came on and said, exercise can kill you, details at 11. I normally go to bed at 10, but I stayed up till 11. But I knew what they were going to say anyway. We had 3 deaths. 3 deaths within 15 minutes. We said, to my knowledge, nobody's beat that. So Detroit, you're right on top. 3 deaths, 15 minutes, 25 to 65 years of age. As a result of these kinds of things, the American Heart Association asked Paul Thompson and I in 2007 to summarize all this stuff for docs around the world. We just finished the revision of this, lots of new stuff, and it's been sent out for review, and my hope is it'll be published later this year. So what's the latest and greatest? But the fact of the matter is, when you go out and do vigorous exercise, there's a host of physiologic and clinical changes. Catecholamines increase, sodium potassium imbalance leads to myocardial irritability, ultimately an increase in ventricular ectopic activity. Big changes, big increases in sympathetic activity, decreases in vagal stimulation, big increases in the rate pressure product, key index of myocardial oxygen demand. You've heard of double product or rate pressure product. That's not a problem unless you got clogged coronary arteries, and then it leads to ischemia, which can be highly arrhythmogenic. Oftentimes people suddenly stop exercise when heart rate's still very, very high. It leads to a decrease in coronary perfusion, exacerbating ischemia, and ultimately triggering even more ventricular ectopic activity. It's a slide Kirk may have shown you this morning. It basically highlights the fact that when we see malignant ventricular arrhythmias, oftentimes the ones that worry me, that has turned my hair from black to gray, are these kinds of things when you're involved in a stress test. And oftentimes these are harbingers or forerunners of malignant ventricular arrhythmias, signs or symptoms of myocardial ischemia. Oftentimes we recognize that extreme exercise can also cause plaque rupture, which can lead to acute myocardial infarction. This isn't right bundle branch block. It isn't early repolarization. This is the real deal. And the patient went to the cath lab, and fortunately, the heart attack was literally halted in progress. So he was at the right place at the right time. What many people don't know, and these are things you guys got to know, is as you look at the risk of acute myocardial infarction, here's the weekly frequency of vigorous physical exertion. And basically what you see is this. Listen carefully. The person who's doing nothing, who once a year or once a decade goes out and does vigorous physical activity, his relative risk increases what? More than what? 100-fold. Whereas the person who's doing regular exercise 4 or 5 days a week, he goes out and does vigorous exercise, his risk increases about what? Twofold. So the fact of the matter is, the more vigorous exercise, the more often, the lower the risk of vigorous physical activity. It's as simple as that. Most people, when they go out and do high-intensity, vigorous physical activity, the relative risk increases very, very high. It's a paper I was involved in, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, where I had the opportunity to review it. These are data looking at all marathons in the US for a 10-year period, 2000 to 2010, over almost 11 million registered marathon runners. They documented very carefully 59 cases of cardiac arrest, average age 42. 42 of these 59 were fatal. What that means, 10 years, 42 fatalities, on average, for marathon running, it's about 4 fatalities a year. So we did set a world record here when we had 3 fatalities in one marathon in the Detroit Free Press. The conclusion, marathoners at a low risk for acute coronary events. The final mile is the greatest risk, and they did clinical and autopsy findings, and the things they found were twofold. Most of the runners who died had either atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease or a big enlarged heart called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Both of those are readily detected with appropriate screening. How about triathlons? Oh, let me go back for a second. When's the most dangerous point? I get this question all the time from race directors. When's the dangerous point in the race? Where should I have my ambulances? Where should I have my CPR teams, my emergency teams? It's the last quarter of the race. And you can clearly see those 42 fatalities, most of them occurred during the final mile or two when people are sprinting, when they're trying to their sodium-potassium imbalance is way out of balance, their body temperature is high, everything goes to hell. Death and cardiac arrest, U.S. triathlon participants. This got my attention, 2017. What did they find here? 9 million participants over 30 years. 135 sudden deaths, 86% men, only 13 survivors. The incidence, 1.74 per 100,000 participants versus 1.01. So what I'm saying to you is, it's almost twice as risky to participate in a triathlon than it is a marathon. Women, who comprised a small percentage, had an incidence of sudden cardiac death that was 3.5-fold less than men. So women, much lower risk. Most sudden cardiac deaths occurred when? Almost 70% occurred during the swim as compared to the bicycle, run, post-race periods. Many of the sudden deaths, almost 40%, were in their first triathlon, which indicates to me maybe these guys, or men or women, didn't train like they should have. So they really got in trouble the first time they really went out. And lastly, autopsies performed on about half the victims revealed that 44% had atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease or cardiomyopathy. Same thing you see with triathletes or marathon runners. Why is the swim so dangerous? As a physiologist, I believe several things. You got increased central blood volume from immersion, which can create added stress on the heart. Catecholamine release, very, very high in the first 30 minutes of the racer, so they're all geared up. Some participants may be unfamiliar with or untrained for open water swimming. Panic attacks have been reported. Adverse water conditions, very cold water, very choppy water, and so on and so forth. Collisions among swimmers, these happen, they're reported. Somebody hits you in the head or something like that, and water rescue is difficult to say the least if somebody is faltering in the water. What about other high-risk activities? These are activities that got my attention over the years. I'll share with you. One of them is racket sports. I remember meeting this guy at a community meeting. We got along fairly well. I'm reading the obituary column 6 months or a year later, and I said, wow, this guy's like 50 years old. How can this be? How could he have died? And then I'm reading the obituary and it says Mark Jenke died of a heart attack while playing racquetball at a local club. He was 55 years of age. And I said, wow, that's probably got to be an anomaly. No, it's not an anomaly. You do a literature search. This is an old publication, British Heart Journal, 1986, a study of 60 deaths associated with squash rackets. You ever watch people play in a squash racket competition? If you got coronary artery disease, that's not the place I want somebody who's had a big anterior infarct back in a court, running all over, stop, start, high intensity, and so on and so forth. So when patients ask me, what do you think? I said, I'm not enthusiastic about it. I'm sorry if you like racquetball, but if your ejection fraction is 20% and you've had a big heart attack, to get back in that racquetball court is not something I'm going to recommend. How about deer hunting? Sue Habanimi from our staff did a phenomenal study years ago. We noticed deer hunters in this area every year die of heart attacks. So what Sue did is she Holter monitored 25 deer hunters, 17 of whom had known coronary disease, and then we did stress tests on those individuals. What she found was astounding. Many of the individuals during deer hunting had heart rates that were similar to or greater than maximal treadmill testing. Here's one guy, see this middle ECG? This guy never moved. He was standing by a tree. And lo and behold, like where the end of that room is, he sees a deer coming out there. He suddenly raises his gun, and his heart rate starts to go, woo. And you know what's happening here? That artifact is due to what? He's actually pulling the trigger right there, and lo and behold, he sees the deer beginning to fall, and what happened to his heart rate? He's gone from 65 up to about 170. That's faster than the Bruce treadmill protocol. Don't tell the docs that. They may start showing their deer hunters a deer and get that heart rate up very, very quickly. Look at this schematic. Simply aiming, shooting a deer, got his heart rate up. One of these guys to 100% of his max GXT heart rate, and the heart rates during dragging were actually higher. Something that really interested me. My chairman at the University of Michigan, I was a graduate student, 1970, came in and told his wife he wasn't feeling well. He'd been shoveling snow. She said, honey, you probably overdid it. Why don't you go upstairs and lie down? Just take it easy. You shouldn't have been out there. He was 61 or 62 at the time. An hour went by, 2 hours went by, 3 hours went by. She went upstairs and found him dead. This got worldwide attention because he was nationally known, but certainly as a graduate student, I said, wow, Dr. Hunsaker's dead, and what was he doing? He was shoveling snow. I also lost another dear friend, a Penn State physician who I work with, who they found face down a couple years after I left Penn State. So I took an interest in this, and then I remember picking up the newspaper. Hold on one second. Yeah. Picking up the newspaper, it said storm leaves at least 13 people dead. And then I read this. At least 8 people died Wednesday after snow-related exertion. In Wayne County alone, 17 heart attack deaths were attributed to exertion since the snow began Tuesday. Most of the victims were older men clearing their walks and driveways of snow. And in my head, a light bulb went on. Wow, it's not just my chairman at U of M. This happens to other people. What's unique about this activity? So we decided to study this activity. The first was done in the parking lot of Beaumont Hospital. I remember going to the grounds crew and saying, I need you guys to spread out about 4 inches of snow across the back part of the parking lot. They said, Dr. Franklin, we normally clear this off to the side so people can come in and drive. I said, well, we're doing a study here. I also said to the Human Investigation Committee, I'd like to study 60, 70, and 80-year-old men with heart disease while they're shoveling. I want to look for arrhythmias and so on and so forth. They looked at me with blank stares. Then they said, we like your idea, but we want you to use healthy young men under the age of 30, and you can extrapolate your data to the 70 and 80 and 90-year-olds, because they didn't want anybody dying in our parking lot, and I understood that. Look at this. We took these healthy guys under the age of 30 or so, did a max treadmill test, then we did maximal, then we had them shovel snow. Here's what it looked like. This was Kim Bonsheim at the time, our manager, but we actually measured ECGs, we measured blood pressures, and we had them wearing a mask so we could actually measure oxygen consumption outside. What do we find? Heart rate during treadmill testing, 179 versus 175. oh my gosh, it's almost the same heart rate, just shoveling on their own. And by the way, we said shovel at your own pace. They shoveled on average 12 times a minute, 10 minutes, 16 pounds per shovel. So it's 12, 16, 10. Do the math. Take this times this, and it's about just under 2,000 pounds. How many of you would tell your 70-year-old father or grandpa or whatever, why don't you go out and move 2,000 pounds in the cold winter storm? Blood pressure was actually higher during snow shoveling, the rate pressure product higher. Here's part of the problem. Measured METs, 5.7 versus 9.3. So the usual warning signs of overexertion, sweating, out of breath, weren't there with snow shoveling, not like a treadmill test. So what you got is what's called a disproportionate myocardial to body oxygen demand. This second study we did, we had 12 days of blizzard conditions. And we had fellows who went to the emergency center and they said, Dr. Franklin, do you have an idea? And I said, yeah. Go to the emergency center, we've had 12 days, find out if we've had any heart attacks over the last 12 days. They came back and said, we've had 20 heart attacks come into Beaumont's emergency center. I said, fine, now go back and see if any of those were engaged in snow removal. They came back and said, 5 of the people were engaged in snow removal. I said, great. Find out their age, find out their medical histories, and so on and so forth. Average age, 55 to 70. All had some type of risk factors, previous heart attack, previous angioplasty. 2 of the 5 were using an EST. What's that? Electric snow thrower when they had their heart attack. 4 of the 5 occurred in the early morning hours when we know there's already a heightened risk for acute myocardial infarction. The editor of American Journal of Cardiology said, I like this, but you're missing some important data, which I thought was a pain. He said, you need BMIs. So I said, the guys, go back, see if you can find the charts, go get the BMIs. The editor was right. 4 of the 5 had BMIs over 30. And by the way, all 5 of these were sedentary, not engaged in any kind of regular activity, just went out and they shoveled their driveway once a year or once a decade. This last one we did, Dr. Pertha Chaudhary did this one, and he went to the county coroner's offices after 2 heavy snowfalls in the Detroit area to see how many sudden deaths occurred. If you look here, the week before the storms, 2. The week of the storms, 24. The week after the storms, 17. So clearly, you can clearly see a big increase. The take-home message here, he identified 36 people who died while removing snow, 33 men, 3 women, and 4 were using an electric snow thrower at the time they died suddenly. More recently, this study got my attention, published 2017, Association between quantity and duration of snowfall and risk of myocardial infarction. This was done in Quebec, Canada. They used what's called a case crossover design. Long story short, what did they find? The likelihood of MI was increased the day after a snowfall among men, but not among women. That wasn't entirely surprising to me. It's kind of a man's thing to go out and shovel heavy, wet snow. This clearly shows hospital admissions were increased, death among men were increased, but not among women. So the take-home message here is this. When I see a patient, and all our staff is well aware of this, and the patient says to me, Doc, I don't care. I've been doing this all my life. I'm going to continue to shovel heavy, wet snow. My answer is you better get a top-of-the-line snow shovel. And he said, what do you mean top-of-the-line snow shovel? And I said, one equipped with defibrillation pads, because your wife or your family members may need it. It's as simple as that. Why is this so dangerous? As a physiologist, I believe there are 5 factors that are involved. As George Clooney would say, a perfect storm. Number 1, relative inefficiency of arm exercise compared to leg exercise. It's harder on the heart cranking an arm ergometer than it is the same workload pedaling with your legs. Working in an upright posture, especially when the legs are frequently motionless. Where does blood pool? You're not walking on a treadmill. Where's blood pool? Lower extremities, while that heart's still going very, very fast. so it exacerbates ischemia. Isometric static exertion, expiratory strain, the Valsalva, breath holding, big increases in heart rate and blood pressure. And finally, inhalation of exposure to cold air. Wait till I show you these data. They're fascinating, showing as temperature increases, heart attacks decrease. Fascinating new study. I'll show you towards the end. How about sexual activity? Sexual activity, I get the question all the time, can I do it? Is it safe? Research says it's 2 to 3 METs, the equivalent of 2 to 3 METs. I believe technically that's an exaggeration because it's the heart rate that goes up so much, not the total energy expenditure. So I believe the vast majority at 2 METs. But if you want to be very conservative, 2 to 3 METs. So I tell patients, you can walk at a 2-mile-per-hour pace without any signs or symptoms of arrhythmias or ischemia, you're fine to go back to sexual activity. This study was fascinating. Showed the relative risk of MI increased 2.1-fold during the 1 hour after sexual activity. But for patients who were habitually sedentary, who did sexual activity, their risk increased what? 4-fold. Why? It's probably more of a stress for those individuals because they're not used to any kind of increases in heart rate or blood pressure. This is fascinating. It's a fascinating case report, but it is true. And everybody cites this study, 1963. 80% of deaths precipitated by sexual intercourse occur in hotel rooms with lovers rather than wives. Most of the victims have been eating, drinking, or perhaps even using some type of drugs. This is very old, so I said, is there something newer I can show you guys? This is the ultimate. This was published in 2017, the biggest, it was from Germany, looking at what they call love death, a retrospective prospective mortality study. 1972 to 2016, 45 years, 38,000 autopsies were performed, 99 cases, 99 cases, 91 of these were men, were connected to sexual activity. The women's and men's mean age 45 and 57. Here's the data that really is rather astounding. If sexual partners were identified, 34 men died during or after sexual contact with a prostitute. In 2 cases, they were with 2 prostitutes at the same time. 9 men died during or after sexual intercourse with their wife. In 7 cases, the sexual partner was a mistress. 4 cases, the life partner. The take-home message, the risk of love death, cardiovascular death during sexual activity increases when the partner is outside of marriage. Here's something you don't know, and the people in the medical community don't tell you this. But if you read the informed consent for almost every surgical procedure, even if it's bizarre, if it's a minor procedure, it almost always says, and in rare instances, a heart attack can occur. It ain't so rare. It ain't so rare. There's 2 kinds of heart attacks that can occur. This was published AJC 2018. Triggering mechanisms, in one case, as a result of the surgical procedure. In some cases, you get a thrombic state called type 1 or plaque rupture. In case number 2, a supply-demand mismatch. Either one of these can cause a heart attack. This study blew my mind. This is one I didn't know this. Widely cited study, surgical data from 56 countries suggested that more than 2 million patients worldwide have major non-cardiac surgical procedures every year. Of those more than 200 million, there are millions that have oftentimes a non-STEMI as part of that surgical procedure. Will have a major vascular complication within 30 days of surgery, and MI is the most common major perioperative vascular complication. In this study, 5% had a perioperative MI, and the 3-day mortality rate was higher for these patients, 12% versus those who didn't. The only independent predictor they found was that each 10-beat increase in the resting heart rate seemed to increase the risk of an MI. So if somebody goes in for abdominal surgery and their resting heart rate prior to that is 90 or 95, It indicates to me that patients could be either better, more fit, are they really fit for surgery, or on beta blockers or medications to lower the demands during surgery. Absolutely fascinating. Topic number 2, psychological stress. Murray Middleman showed you get angry, and I could understand this because I've had many spouses say to me over the years, my husband Jack or Joe had his heart attack after he got in a big argument with his boss. Is there any relationship? My answer is always the same. Your husband had underlying heart disease, but the cascade of physiologic responses going back and forth likely triggered the MI. This study, during a period of 1 hour after an episode of anger, the relative risk increased 9-fold as compared to sitting down reading the newspaper. So don't tell me that psychologic factors can't trigger MIs. They can. This is a beautiful schematic by Alan Rosansky in which he showed acute stress leads to sympathetic nervous system stimulation, a host of physiologic effects, and clinical consequences, including myocardial ischemia, arrhythmias, more vulnerable plaque, and the potential for thrombosis. I've been reading the scientific literature for 50 years. You say to me, Barry, give me one study that really got your attention. It's this next one. Published in New England Journal of Medicine. Let me set the stage for you here. It's absolutely fascinating. And this guy dreamed it up, Robert Kloner. 4:31 in the morning, January 17th, 1994, there was the Northridge earthquake in California. It was one of the biggest earthquakes they ever had. Kloner said, you know, if stress is really a factor, then that day of that earthquake, if you eliminate people who bridges fell down and houses fell down and so on and so forth, who died because of those things, if you eliminate those, you should have seen some slight blip in the number of heart attacks that occurred. In other words, you're sleeping at 4:31 in the morning, all of a sudden your house is shaking. That could trigger a heart attack. So if he was right, you should have seen on that particular day, especially early morning, a blip in the number of sudden deaths due to heart disease. I'll play Fox News. I'll show you that you decide. Look at this. 25 sudden cardiac deaths compared to the days before, the days after. Their conclusion, Northridge earthquake, significant trigger of sudden death due to cardiac causes independent of physical exertion. This finding, along with the unusually low incidence in the week after the earthquake, suggests that emotional stress can trigger cardiac events in people who are predisposed to such events. And this one got my attention. It's why every time I go to a U of M game or a Michigan State game, there's always 3-4 ambulances out in front. That's not by chance. They know from these games somebody's going to get an acute coronary syndrome. Sometimes 3 or 4 acute coronary syndromes, people yelling and screaming with underlying heart disease. In this study, they looked at Munich, Germany, and this was soccer World Cup was conducted in Munich. This was back in 2006, 2007, and basically what they did is look at the days that the German team played. What did they find? On days involving the German team, the incidence of cardiac emergencies was 2.7 times that of the regular period. For a minute, increased 3.2. For women, 1.82. Viewing a stressful soccer match more than doubles the risk of an acute coronary event. Say, show me the data. Here are the data. And the days the German team played in 2006 are these peaks right here compared to the control periods. This is fascinating. You ever read about somebody dying, a long-standing couple, and then the next day or the next week, the partner dies? This was fascinating. Found this in Bottom Line earlier in the year. And what they said is Judith Gerson Lieber were married 72 years. She was a handbag designer. He was an artist. According to their New York obituary, she was 97, he was 96 when they died of dual heart attacks just a few hours apart earlier this year. This is not that unusual. This is not that unusual. When people lose a family member, a spouse, whatever, they're at heightened risk. This study clearly shows it. Once again, Mostovsky, Middleman. Risk of acute MI after the death of a significant person in one's life. Look what they found. The incidence rate of MI onset was elevated 21-fold. There it is. Within 24 hours of the death of a significant person, and declined steadily thereafter. But even at 30 days, it was still increased threefold. Here's that 21-fold increase. So people are especially susceptible during that time. Docs would be well advised to maybe increase beta blockers. Tell them, I want you on your aspirin, I want you to get sufficient rest, and so on and so forth. It's a high-risk period. What about atrial fibrillation? I never realized this. You see it, but it's oftentimes due to emotional stress, a common triggering factor in increasing the levels of perceived stress. When you see somebody all of a sudden in atrial fibrillation, this study suggests something's going on at home, at work, and so on and so forth. Long-term risk of atrial fib after the death of a partner. We conducted a population-based case control study using Danish health registries to examine the risk of atrial fib following the death of a partner. Look at this. Partner bereavement was experienced by 17,000 cases and 168,000 controls, associated with a transient increased risk, highest 8 to 14 days after the loss. The risk increased about twofold, after which it gradually declined. The severely stressful event of losing a partner was followed by a transient increased risk of atrial fib lasting 1 year, especially for predicted losses. Here's what it looks like. You lose a spouse in the 8 to 14 days after that loss, the risk of atrial fibrillation just about doubled. This is fascinating, and I have a note or two that I want to share with you on this. Takotsubo syndrome. Anybody heard of it before? So you're kind of aware of it then. Okay. Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. Nearly 72% of patients with Takotsubo syndrome had an identifiable trigger, physical trigger, emotional trigger, or both. This mimics heart attack. These are people who come into the emergency center, chest pain, ECG, big ST segment changes, and so on and so forth. It's believed to be a reflex response controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which may be due to catecholamine excess or direct neural innervation of the brainstem. Women, far more likely, over 50, far more likely to be particularly susceptible, only 10% in men. What is it? This was a fascinating case report done by a good friend, cardiologist on staff at Beaumont, and I want to make sure I get the case right, so I'll share it with you, but it's fascinating. Dr. Dan Walsh published this in our State of the Heart newsletter. He goes on in this to say, on Thursday evening, sometime Thursday evening 2011, I got a call from one of my patients, 87 years of age. She said her blood pressure was about 75 or 80 over 60. She just didn't feel right. I said, well, why don't you go to the emergency room? She said, no, I don't want to go to the emergency room. He said, well, then, are you sure? She said, no. He said, come on into the office tomorrow. Came into the office the next day, and her ECG revealed ST segment changes that were not there prior. Her previous workups were negative for coronary disease. They did her labs. Her labs were consistent with myocardial injury. They did a cath. Had no coronary obstruction. But her previous ejection fraction, which was 55%, was now 25%. And her heart took a very unusual vase-like position, and they diagnosed it as Takotsubo syndrome. So Takotsubo is a fishing pot in Japan used to trap octopus. So let me share with you a little bit on this woman's history. On her left forearm, she had tattooed on her left forearm A6733. A stands for Auschwitz. She was in a concentration camp for 2 years. Her job, which saved her life, was to go through the clothing of Jewish people who were going to the gas chamber because they found that many of the Jews would hide inside the lining diamonds, behind the buttons, coins that they could use to maybe get the guards to give them more food, more clothing, something. Bottom line is, she was a survivor, and what happened in this case was astounding. 87 years old, over the years, she'd tell school children a little bit about her Holocaust experiences. But this one particular day, there were 2 groups of school children, and she was asked to do this same talk twice, describing the horrors of the situation. That was too much for this woman's heart to bear, and she developed Takotsubo syndrome. Topic number 3, chemical stress. I see patients all the time, and you do too, and you ought to know these things, because I see on the chart marijuana. Whoa! And it's amazing to me, people have no idea how bad it is. Murray Middleman showed the risk of heart attack increases 5-fold in the 1 hour after marijuana use. And if you see a 26-year-old kid or a 31-year-old person come to the emergency center, say, how can this person have a heart attack? It's oftentimes due to the fact they were using cocaine, which increases the relative risk of acute MI 24-fold. 24-fold. We also know that bad environments can trigger heart attacks. It's been shown study after study. In the opinion of the writing group, the overall evidence is consistent with a causal relationship between particulate matter of a certain size, cardiovascular morbidity, and mortality. What about secondhand smoke? You guys have all been in these arguments that I have too. Some people say, well, I got a right to smoke. And somebody says, well, I got a right to breathe clean air. How do I respond to those things? I respond with the next 3 studies. Famous study done, Circulation 2013, Gilpin County, Colorado. Lots of casinos. The authorities in Gilpin County, Colorado said, we're going to have a smoking ban, but we're not going to do it in the casinos. We'll do it every place else. They did a smoking ban, and what did they find? Initial implementation of smoke-free law, which exempted casinos, was followed by a 23% drop in ambulance calls from locations other than casinos. No change in casinos. It was so compelling that the next 2 years later, they said, it's got to be all over the place. Then they looked at the same data. Law requiring smoke-free casinos was followed by a 19% drop in ambulance calls from casinos for heart problems, but no change in calls originating outside where they already had the smoking ban. Don't tell me that breathing somebody else's smoke can't trigger acute MIs. Unquestionably it does. Famous study in a decent journal called New England Journal of Medicine in Scotland decided years ago they were going to go to a smoke-free ordinance. By the end of March 2006, smoking had been prohibited in all enclosed public places throughout Scotland. Look at this. The number of admissions for acute coronary syndromes decreased by how much? I can't read that. Louder. 17% as compared with a 4% reduction in England, which had no such legislation. During the same period, a mean annual decrease in Scotland was 3%, and the maximum decrease ever was what? 9%. So clearly, this made a difference. You say, show me the data. Here's the data. This is before heart attacks and after the legislation. So these things, beyond just the things we're doing in the hospital, those people who make the decisions should be aware of these data. Fascinating study. Bremen, Germany. Initiated a smoking cessation. You banned it in all public places. What did they find? Significant decline in hospital admissions due to STEMIs. These are the big heart attacks. In non-smokers was observed after the smoking ban came into effect. These results may be explained by the protection of non-smokers from passive smoking and the absence of such an effect in smokers who are regularly exposed to cigarette smoking. Look at these data. Smoking ban went into effect. What happened in Bremen, Germany? Clearly, as you look at total STEMIs, there was a decrease. Where did the decrease occur? In what population? Non-smokers. Yep. These are compelling data. Topic number 4, sleep deprivation. I'm getting near the end. Sleep deprivation, acute infection, weather conditions, and dangerous days of the week or year. It's a fascinating report in New England Journal of Medicine. Basically, what they said is, where you and I, we set our clocks ahead. If we don't get more sleep, you're shortchanged an hour of sleep. In the days after we spring forward for daylight savings, there's a spike. This is normal. These are the days after the time advance. You can see higher rates of heart attacks. And when you fall back, what happens? Slightly lower rates of heart attacks. What about risk of heart attack and stroke after infection and vaccination? These data provide unequivocal evidence that both are associated with a risk in vascular events. Influenza, tetanus, pneumococcal vaccinations do not produce an increase in the risk of vascular events, but if people experience an infection, during that infection, their risk is transiently increased. As a result, we have good data in the patients we counsel to simply say, hey, just like cholesterol is important, blood pressure is important, exercise, make sure you get a flu shot. And if you say, well, what's the data? Here are the data. They're pretty compelling. JAMA, 2013. Researchers pulled data from 6 clinical trials, 6,700 people. About 1/3 had known heart disease, the others didn't. Those who got a flu shot were 36% less likely to suffer cardiovascular events during the following year. And for those who recently had a heart problem and got the vaccination, their risk decreased by what? 55%. What about cold weather? We got it here. What about cold weather? Does that really influence heart attacks? The answer is yes. 2018, JAMA, cardiology. Determined if weather is associated with day-to-day incidence of acute MI. In over 274,000 patients, average age 71, they looked at the incidence of heart attacks with lower air temperature, higher wind velocity, and shorter sunshine duration. The most pronounced association was observed for air temperature, where a 1 standard deviation increase in air temperature, this should be 7.4 degrees centigrade, was associated with a 2.8% reduction in the risk of MI. This was consistent for ST elevation and non-elevation. So look at these data. And basically what you see, total MI, non-STEMI, STEMI, highest in very low temperatures, less than 0 degrees centigrade, or less than 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's where the greatest number of heart attacks occur. Is there a dangerous day of the week and a non-dangerous day of the week? Yeah. Chances are you're not going to experience a heart attack on a Sunday, or a family member is not going to experience a heart attack on a Sunday. But lots of studies now suggest that Monday is the most dangerous day of the week. After a relaxing weekend, you go back, things are piled high, there's all new emails and so on and so forth. So the most dangerous day of the week, in study after study, 30 to 33% increased relative risk on Mondays in working people. This was fascinating. British Medical Journal, 2018. This was done in Sweden, and they have a tremendous database where they can look at heart attacks, day of the week, holidays, sporting events, and so on and so forth. What did they find? 283,000 cases of heart attacks reported in Sweden between 1998 and 2013. And as I said, They have meticulous data, probably better than any other country, on the number of heart attacks, when they occurred, what the day was, what the time was. What did they find? What they found was fascinating. This shouldn't surprise you guys. On average, Swedes suffered 50 heart attacks per day throughout the year. But one day, they averaged 69 heart attacks. Happened on December 24th. Almost year to year to year to year, there was a 37% higher rate of heart attacks on Christmas Eve. In addition, heart attacks peaked around 10 p.m. that day. The risk, not surprisingly, was highest in older people, people who've had angioplasties, bypass surgeries, and so on and so forth, suggesting external triggers in the risk of heart attacks on Christmas Eve, with the most dangerous time being 10 p.m. Say why? They speculated several simultaneous factors. Excessive food intake, excessive alcohol consumption. One drink is fine, 2 drinks may be okay. When you have 3, 4, 5 drinks, it has a negative inotropic effect on the heart, which I tell patients means transiently screws up the pumping capacity of your heart. That's fact. If you got an ejection fraction of 20, 25%, and then you transiently screw up the pumping capacity of the heart, you're asking for trouble. Long distance travel. I can appreciate that, having been on a plane for 10 hours yesterday. Long distance travel, heavy physical exertion, packages, snow removal, psychological stressors, cold temperatures. Really quite astounding. So to conclude, what I want to leave you with, these triggers are particularly applicable to people who have vulnerable plaque, blood that is more susceptible to clotting, and a myocardium that has a high prevalence of residual myocardial ischemia already. How many slides left? Great. Here's something that I think you'll also say, I didn't know that. Cleveland Clinic, 2001. They looked at their entire database. They're a pretty big cardiovascular program. What did they find? Looking at thousands and thousands of caths, coronary disease, age, gender. What they found blew my mind. So what they found is that 85% of all people over the age of 50 have atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. If you grew up on White Castle and Ben & Jerry's and you're using a remote and this, that, and the other thing, you're surrounded by this stuff. 85%. These show that 85% of individuals over 50 have atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So a friend and colleague, Marty Grace in Chicago, Sherry's dad, a cardiologist par excellence, said, for me the question isn't whether middle-aged and older adults have heart disease, they probably do. It's how do you prevent acute catastrophic cardiovascular events, the kind of events that killed the beloved newscaster, Tim Russert, or the fine actor James Gandolfini, both in their 50s. Take-home message is this: you have a profound influence on patients every day. And what you say and what their doctor says makes a difference. I think there are important counseling implications. If you say to me, Barry, as I leave here, what do you want me to remember out of all these studies? How do I apply this to the people I see? I'd make 6 or 7 points. Number 1, there's good evidence that chronic moderate to vigorous physical activity, subjecting the body to regular increases in heart rate and metabolism called ischemic preconditioning, conditions the body so when you got a rise in heart rate or some additional stress, it's not as profound an impact because the body's already used to these stressful increases in heart rate and metabolism. Encouraging people to take cardioprotective medications, beta blockers, aspirin. These do make a difference in terms of preventing acute cardiovascular events. I tell patients if you're getting less than 7.5 hours sleep, you're not getting enough. Besides that, if you're getting 3, 4, 5 hours of sleep and you got a weight problem, that's part of the weight problem because it screws up two hormones called leptin and ghrelin, which makes you hungry and makes you eat the wrong foods. So avoid periods of sleep deprivation, illicit drug use, marijuana and cocaine. It's amazing to me, the cardiologists that never even mentioned marijuana in people who have marijuana in the chart. And I say, if you don't believe, here, let me show you the paper by Middleman. It's a 5-fold increase. As well as very high caffeine stimulants, the 5-hour energies. And I've seen people who've taken 3, 4, 5 of those, not one of those things, which can lead to big trouble. Finally, enhancing mental stress reducing exercises and anger management strategies. Once had a patient who said he got pissed off because he was standing in the line that says 10 items or less. And the jerk in front of him clearly had 14 items in his cart. And he was on his toes and he was counting. This asshole, he's got a lot more. I said, if that bothers you, you got a real problem. And today, if somebody cuts you off in traffic, the worst thing to do is suddenly speed up. And definitely don't give them hand signals because you don't know what they've got in the car in front of them, unfortunately, today. Counseling unfit, habitually sedentary patients, known or suspected coronary disease to avoid unaccustomed heavy physical exertion, high-risk activities, racquetball, snow removal. The new ACSM guidelines, which we're talking about because we're starting to get the higher risk people without known coronary disease, is this. You do not start them jogging. Even if, well, I was a college athlete, I used to run long distance. Well, you're now 60. You're not going to start running long distance again. Not in our program. Maybe at the YMCA or another hospital, but not in our program, okay? Everybody, ACSM says, the first 2 to 3 months, start walking. Flat walking. 2 miles an hour and gradually pick it up. 2 METs, you go to 3 miles an hour. 3 METs. Go to 4 miles an hour, about 5 METs. Stay below 6 METs. And if at any time they develop any pain or discomfort from the belly button on up, tell them to stop the exercise and get medically checked out. But nobody comes in or should come in and day 1, day 2, be running like hell. Unless you got a stress test, and if the stress test shows they got a 12 MET capacity, yeah, then you can let those people start at 6 METs if everything looks good. But for the average person, if you don't have it, start them walking. It's as simple as that, regardless of how fit they were 40 years before. My own opinion on high-intensity interval training is it may be slightly more effective in improving VO2 max in some things, but when it's equated for caloric expenditure, it's very similar to moderate intensity training. Moderate intensity training is better for weight reduction. Moderate intensity training is better for lowering resting heart rate. So I myself don't recommend, especially in non-medical environments, go out and do high-intensity training. Because if they're at the YMCA and they're pushing themselves up to 90, 95%, and they go down, you're not there or your nurses aren't there. And that to me is the wrong kind of message to give. If it's the military and they're 18 years old and they're healthy, wow, that may be a fast way to improve their fitness. But not for the person who's in an environment where you don't know if there's adequate medical assistance. And over time, the likelihood of myocardial ischemia or plaque rupture increases in the patients we serve. Finally, strict enforcement of environmental regulations regarding air pollution. I tell patients, limit outdoor activities when pollution levels are high, because the data are there. You're breathing lots of smoke in downtown Chicago or whatever, your risk of a heart attack increases slightly. So hopefully that clarifies for you the latest and greatest on triggers of acute coronary events and practical things that you can do for them. Thank you very much. Do we have time for a question or two or not? Yes, question or two or 3. Yes?
In reference to you talking about the secondhand smoke environment, what about any data on the e-cigarettes, or in our area there's a lot of the vaping?
Yeah, the question is the data on vaping, what do I think about it? First of all, There are no good data to show that it helps long-term stopping cigarette smoking. There's no good data. Number two, there aren't good data to suggest it's much healthier than regular cigarette smoking. Number three, because of those things, places like the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology don't endorse it. Number four, nicotine is addicting. It's as simple as that. And we don't know 5, 10, 15 years down the road what the ramifications are going to be. So for all those reasons, I'm opposed to it. I can also tell you my wife and I were in Italy. It's far more prevalent in Italy than it is here. And I gave a lecture in Italy this fall, and the guy who invited me, who's a cardiologist, was sitting in the front row vaping, and I'm walking through the smoke. I mean, it's unbelievable. The custom is entirely different. They just view it as very acceptable. It shouldn't be acceptable. Yes?
What would you advise for patients who want to get back into deer hunting?
What would I advise for patients who want to get back to deer hunting? It's a good question. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'd say discuss with your physician. I think number one, a regular exercise program where you're routinely getting your heart rate up and blood pressure up and your metabolism up is a good way to help protect against that. Number two, absolutely no dragging the deer. And number three, I think it's very realistic to talk to your physician about the possibility on days that you're going to do it to doubling up potentially on your beta blocker that day or something to keep the brakes and that heart rate. Even from seeing the deer, instead of going to 160, maybe it'll keep you at a 120 or 115 or something along those lines. Absolutely no drag in the deer and so on and so forth. For those who say, I'm not going to listen to you, I'm still going to do it, those are reasonable alternatives. Yeah. Okay. Thank you much.